Question, do you ever find yourself wondering what you should be praying for? Maybe for yourself or for others. Does that ever cross your mind? Maybe you have, set aside a certain time for prayer, and so you embark on that, and then you're contemplating, what exactly should I be praying for? Well, I don't know if it's true for anyone else, but I do. I sometimes find myself wondering that. And I would just let you know what I find to be a very valuable resource on such occasions. And that is to read the prayers of the Bible, the prayers that have been preserved for us in Scripture. Among those, certainly the Apostle Paul's prayers. Like his Lord, Paul was a man of prayer. That's very evident. You find him praying regularly. You find him praying frequently. He often mentions that throughout his epistles to individuals as well as congregations, and sometimes not only reminding them and letting them know that he was praying for them, but sometimes he would even record his prayers on their behalf within the very texts of those inspired letters. Sometimes it would be the prayer itself, or other times at least letting them know what he was praying by way of content, what he was praying for them. And so again, I find that to be a valuable resource, and so you can appreciate then that I would sometimes have occasion to visit here in Ephesians chapter 3. Because in Ephesians chapter 3, beginning in verse 14, we have one of those occasions where the Apostle Paul, it appears to me, was actually praying for his fellow saints there in Ephesus, and as we will come to see by way of extension, for all Christians. Now, please understand, I mentioned Paul was a praying man. This wasn't even the first one in this letter that we find. When you back up to the first chapter of Ephesians there, beginning in verse 17, Paul again would be praying for the saints, even as he was scribing this letter, if you will. But notice Paul's particular petition here in behalf of the brethren, and we'll read basically the entire prayer, maybe omitting the doxology at the end, but read with me there, beginning in verse 14. For this cause I bow my knees unto the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, of whom the whole family in heaven and earth is named, that He would grant you, according to the riches of His glory, to be strengthened with might by His Spirit in the inner man, that Christ may dwell in your hearts by faith, that ye, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all saints what is the breadth and length and depth and height, and to know the love of Christ, which passeth knowledge, that ye might be filled with all the fullness of God. Now again, there are a number of petitions that make up this prayer by the Apostle Paul, which again, initially and foremost was in behalf of the saints there at Ephesus. But notice, even in the prayer, he talks about all saints there in verse 18. And maybe you can identify the petitions with being introduced with that. All right? So his prayer is, verse 16, that. Again, later in verse 16, that. Verse 17, that. And so you'll find that, and maybe that's a good way to kind of identify some of the petitions that comprised his prayer. And I want you to look specifically at the close of verse 17. I tend to agree with a commentator that I read. This seems to be kind of growing out of the petition that he made at the beginning of verse 17, that Christ may dwell in your hearts by faith. And if that's the case, that you then would be rooted and grounded in love. That you may be able to comprehend with all saints what is the breadth and the length and depth and height, and to know the love of Christ, which passeth knowledge, that you might be filled with all the fullness of God. There, beginning at the close of verse 17, really through verse 19. What does that prayer really petition? Or what does that petition particularly center on? It's love, right? Paul was praying in behalf of the Ephesians about love. Love. You might be rooted and grounded in love. Now, the word Paul uses here is a very familiar one in the New Testament. It's the word agape. It's the highest form of love, if you will, among the various Greek terms that are sometimes translated love. And the reason it's the highest form is because it corresponds to divine love. It's the love of God. In fact, the Bible explains for us God is love. In 1 John chapter 4, verse 8, and then again in verse 16 of that same chapter. And there the word is this word, agape. God is love. It's a divine love. It's a love that has its very essence, its very concept in who God is. Vines offers some helpful insight with regards to a word study on the subject of love and particularly this love. He says concerning agapeo, which would be the verb, or agape, he says, quote, "It is the characteristic word of Christianity." Later on, he, quoting somebody else, would say, "This love can be known only by the actions that it prompts." Friends, this type of love is not something that is known just because somebody acknowledges it, somebody confesses or professes it. This love is known only by its actions. Later on, he, quoting again from somebody else, says, Christian love, agape love, whether exercised toward the brethren or toward men generally, is not an impulse from the feelings. It does not always run with the natural inclinations, nor does it spend itself only upon those for whom some affinity is discovered. Love seeks the welfare of all. Love works no ill to any. Love seeks opportunity to do good to all men, and especially toward them who are of the household of faith. Galatians 6 and verse 10. By way of summary, if I could, agape love, friends, it's an active love of the will. And friends, we have to understand it that way because otherwise we would have no comprehension for what it means when Jesus commands of us to love our enemies. Is that a natural inclination? Does that go in line with your emotions toward your enemies? No, it has to be a love of the will. It has to be something that you choose to do. It is a love that by choice seeks the highest good of its object. That's agape love. Again, an active love of the will, a love that by choice seeks the highest good of its object. That's what Paul is praying concerning the saints there at Ephesus and all saints. And what particularly was his prayer as it relates to agape love? Well, look at it again. Look there at the end of verse 17. That you be rooted and grounded in this love. You know, Paul is borrowing language there, concepts that we would understand from plant life and from architecture. Rooted. And so the idea is God wants God's intention, Paul's prayer for the saints is that they would allow their hearts to sink deep, spread out wide, drink in the nature of God, love. But not only that it would also be grounded. It'd be steadfast. It would be constant. It speaks of stability. Friends, it speaks of being unmovable. Unmovable. That's what Paul's desire is. That's what his petition to the Father is as it relates to Christians and their relationship to agape love. He wants us to have our hearts sunk deep into it, into the very nature of who God is, drink deep from it, and be steadfast in it. Unmovable. It doesn't matter what circumstances are going on in our lives or around us. We are grounded in love. That was the first, but then notice the second. It really comes in his expression there in verse 19, that you might know the love of Christ. See, that's where we really discern what true agape love is. Again, it's the very essence of God. Jesus, while He was on the earth, He was the epitome, He was the personification of what agape love looks like. When you know Christ's love, you know agape love as it really is. And notice it has dimensions. He mentioned those back in verse 18, that you may be able to comprehend with all the saints the breadth, the length, the depth, the height of this love. And you know what I've always found amazing about this, Ricky, is here is Paul praying that we would know the love of Christ, and his next statement is that you cannot know. That is past knowledge. You see, we will never, in its fullest sense, comprehend agape love. But Paul's desire, God's intent is for us to know it to the greatest degree that we can. And that's going to take an investment. That's going to take effort. We're going to have to let our roots sink deep and spread out wide. If this prayer is ever going to be answered concerning me, concerning you. Now, Paul is making these petitions to God. God obviously has a role in it, and God has fulfilled His role in perfection. He's revealed it to us. He's allowed us to know what it is. He's given His counsel as our spiritual father, that we ought to be, immersed in it. But do I have a responsibility? Do you have a responsibility? Did the Ephesian saints have a responsibility? Let me ask you, how can you know something you've never studied? I remember, I'm sure I've shared this with you before, but going to some kind of production that was put on by my oldest daughter's class, and I never heard the song, but they sang, "Knowledge is power, you know what you know." And I thought, wow, that's a great principle. Knowledge is power. I mean, that's something good to teach your children, right? But you know what? It's only powerful if you then take that knowledge and put it into practice, right? You can know a lot. And if you never use that knowledge, it isn't powerful. It's just knowledge. And so what's my responsibility as it relates to this prayer? What would be the Ephesian Christians' responsibility? Number one, they were going to have to study it. If they were ever going to know the love of Christ, they were going to have to study the life of Christ. They were going to have to, if they were ever going to comprehend all of its dimensions, they were going to have to study it. And it was going to require diligence, earnest effort to know it. And then once they have known it, to the best of their ability, now they were going to have to honestly ask, is that what I'm practicing every day? Am I rooted in that kind of love? Am I grounded in that kind of love? Because again, friends, that's when the question really takes on personal application. It's not just whether you do know it, but now you're supposed to be rooted and grounded in it. Now it's supposed to be assimilated into your life. So I got to ask, that's the second part. I got to study it so I can know it, but then I got to ask that heart-searching question, is that what I practice? Do I practice true agape love? And that's where we kind of started last week, with that question. And as we stated at that question, or at that time, friends, if you're going to know agape love, that study is going to have to entail a careful consideration of 1 Corinthians 13. 1 Corinthians 13, as we alluded to last week, has been often styled the Bible chapter of love. The love chapter. Why? Because the entire chapter is devoted to, yes, agape love. It talks about the preeminence of it. It talks about if you don't have this, it doesn't matter what else you do have. It doesn't matter if you have the greatest spiritual gifts. It doesn't matter if you're so charitable and so self-denying that you would give your life as a martyr. If you don't have love, you're nothing. It will profit you nothing. The close of the chapter says, this love is really the more excellent way. Why? Because it's more permanent than these other spiritual miraculous gifts that the Corinthians seem to be so enamored by. But this is permanent. It joins faith. It joins hope. And those three are the cardinal, again, fundamental, permanent pillars of Christianity. But even of those three, love, agape, is the greatest. Why? Well, Paul doesn't explain it, but it would appear that he's talking about the fact that, again, love is divine. Nowhere in the Bible does it say God is faith. Nowhere does it say God is hope, but it does say God is love. And not only that, but friends, someday when this life is over, faith is no longer going to be needed. Hope will become fruition because now it will be seen, and what you see you don't hope for. But love will continue. It's eternal. It's permanent. And that makes it supreme. But it's really the middle verses. It's really the middle verses that are really going to come into play when I start asking myself, well, do I understand the dimensions of true agape love? Do I practice it in my life? Because there you have the profile of love. This is what love looks like. This is what love looks like in a person. And as we said, you could read verses 4 through 7, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 through, 7, the beginning of 8, and you could put God's name everywhere you see the name or the word charity or the word agape love. Because it's true, that's who God is. It would be true if you put Christ's name in. The real challenge is, what if I put my name in there? See, I'm supposed to be rooted and grounded in it. Paul's desire was that I would comprehend it as it really is. And this is how true agape love looks in my life. Am I those things? And again, it would be certainly a very challenging exercise to do that. But friends, to kind of make it more pointed, more practical, I suggested maybe all we got to do is look at that first virtue. First characteristic of true agape love. Because verse 4 starts out, love suffereth long. If you're going to know agape love, here's one of the qualities you need to know about it. It's patient. That's the way the New American Standard Version translates that. It's patient. It suffers long. And friends, if I'm going to pose or face the question, do I practice true agape love? I could ask, at least in part, this: do I practice the patience of love? The patience of love. And I want to pick up our study today by trying to gain a little insight into what is that. First of all, I hope you can appreciate the timeliness of that particular virtue of love. Friends, we live in a very impatient world. A lot of things probably have contributed to that. Some of it is the fact that we live in an instant world. Everything's instant. And so we want it now. We even got those advertisements, right? It's my money, I want it now. We have adults screaming that stuff on TV. Sometimes you expect it of children, but when adults start screaming, I want it now, well, that speaks to the world in which we live. We live in an instant society. And when you are accustomed to getting everything now, when you've got to exercise some patience, sometimes that's a real struggle, right? So let's even talk about this quality of patience. Gain a little insight to it. And again, you might appreciate, I like words. I like, to better understand them. And so maybe you take an English dictionary, look up the word patient or patience. And what you come to find out is, etymologically, it's derived from the Latin. And the Latin term meant to suffer or endure. To suffer or to endure. And Webster's goes on to explain then, by way of application, if you will, it suggests the capacity for calm endurance. Calm meaning uncomplainingly. Can you see the chat? I can just see the expressions on people's faces. Calm endure, uncomplainingly, without complaint. And probably as we then try to take that quality and attach it to, some hypothetical person, who is a patient person? Wouldn't we perceive a patient person to be an individual who is able to exhibit calm, without complaint, endurance in the various situations that he or she encounters? So again, what would that involve? Well, I would suggest that a patient person then would be one who could demonstrate calm endurance in time of delay. How do you do with that? A patient person is able to wait. I know I mentioned it last week. I'm sorry, just for me, I can't hear that idea of, I can't wait without thinking of my granddaughter. I mean, she says it every day to me. And I only see her a couple hours every day. And I can't wait, Papa. You got to wait. I'm sorry, you're talking about an event 2 weeks away. I can't wait, Papa. She told me that it's impossible for her. I'm trying to help her understand patience isn't something you're born with. You got to develop it. But don't we appreciate that a patient person is a person who can endure without complaint in times they are called upon to wait? How do you do with that? Can you appreciate living in an impatient world? Sometimes we just don't like to wait, do we? And so you walk into the doctor's office, and your appointment is at 11 o'clock. You get there at 10 to 11, and every seat is filled. You kind of know you're in for a wait. Just don't do well. Robert, if you live up in my neck of the woods, as you well know, you're going to wait in traffic. You are going to wait. You cannot be an impatient person and drive in Hampton Roads traffic. You're going to wait. You're going to wait. But not only in times of delay, but a patient person, we would also expect to be an individual who could demonstrate calm, uncomplainingly, endurance in times of difficulty. Times of difficulty of our lives. Friends, those difficulties might be physically, might be emotionally. In other words, we would expect a patient person to be an individual who can suffer without complaint. Sometimes for long periods. Calm endurance. Times of difficulty. And then in times when we are damaged. A patient person we would expect to be able to, with calm endurance, hold out during occasions when we suffer wrong at the hands of other people. In other words, we would say that a patient person is going to have to be forbearing, sometimes even forgiving. And then finally, we would also expect a patient person to be able to exhibit this calm endurance in the presence of defects. What I mean by that is when you are needing to bear with the shortcomings of others, some defects in their character. Maybe yourself. Maybe yourself. And so, in other words, a patient person is not only a person who can wait, not only a person who is able to suffer, and sometimes long periods, not only a person who can, again, be forbearing and forgiving of others, but also a person who can be gentle and characterized by meekness and, I guess you could say, the idea of understanding in the presence of other people and their defects. Now, all of these, and there might be some others, but I tried to at least provide a general summarization of circumstances that become the proving ground for patience. Remember, that's what we're asking. Do I practice the patience of love? Well, how do I know that? How do I know that? It's not just a matter of saying, yes, I'm a patient person. That's kind of like, again, my grandchildren, they're finishing up their school year, and I might ask them, how are you doing in math? I'm doing great, Paw. Then they bring home a D. You see, that's the test. It's one thing to say, yeah, I got this. I got this. But it's another thing when that is put to the test. How do you do? Here are the circumstances that provide the proving ground, the tests, if you will, as to whether or not you really are a patient person. How do you do during times of delay? How do you do during times of difficulty? How do you do when you're damaged by somebody else, what they say, what they do to you? How do you do in the presence of defects that you observe in other people? Are you able with calm endurance, uncomplainingly, to bear up under those? Now, friends, again, I think we would probably say, those are some of the, again, circumstances in which patience is going to be either known or shown not to exist. But would you not concur with me that exercising patience, calm endurance, when dealing with other people is sometimes the most challenging? Sometimes delay isn't the result of other people. Sometimes difficulty might be, again, a physical ailment or injury or again, emotional stress that isn't necessarily brought on by other people. But look at those last two. Now you're really getting down to how do I deal with other people who damage me, or whose defects I have to be exposed to and influenced by. How do I do with that? Because what I'm trying to help us appreciate, friends, is that's what the patience of love really has to do with. Is my patience in the presence of other people and responding to other people. And sometimes that is the most difficult occasions for exercising patience. We looked at this verse, but again, just by way of review, go back with me again to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. And look there at verse 14. Now we exhort you, brethren, warn them that are unruly, comfort the feeble-minded, support the weak, be patient toward all. Be patient toward all. Now we're really getting back to the patience of love. Because again, love has to do with my responsibility to others, right? You love somebody. Somebody is the object of that love. And here, Paul, in giving us a profile of agape love, says love is patient. So when I am loving somebody else, it's a love that allows me to exercise calm endurance without complaint when other people damage me and when I have to be around folks in their defects. Did you even notice that in these exhortation here? Comfort or warn the unruly. How do you like to be around unruly people? Comfort the feeble-minded. Support the weak. How do we do when we're around weak people? Is it sometimes challenging to be patient with them? And then at the end he says, be patient with all. All of these groups or anyone else. And again, friends, that really gets back down to what practicing true agape love is all about. And particularly the patience of love. So let's go back to our text there in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and again look at, I'll tell you what, rather than go back there, we're short on time. Let me invite you quickly over to James chapter 5. I want to read something from Brother Woods as we're running out of time here, but the word that Paul uses when he says charity is long-suffering. Again, the New American Standard, charity is patient. Love is patient. The word he uses, and I'm not about to try to pronounce it, it's about this long, all right, but it's made up of two words in the Greek. And those two words basically suggest the idea of macro means long. That's the first part. And the second is the idea of temper. Temper. If you saw it, it looks like almost thermometer. I mean, it's the word we probably get, temperature. All right? But it's to be long-tempered. That's what Paul is saying about agape love. The first quality he mentions, now again, whether there's any significance to that, I don't know. But the first one he mentions is this love, agape love, is to be long-tempered. Long-tempered. And again, we would expect this to deal with patience toward people, right? Loving. You love things, you love people. This type of love. It's a choice. It's seeking the highest good of another. Well, the reason I mention that is because Brother Woods really provides some help here as it relates to the New Testament use of patience. Do you remember James 1? How it tells us that we're supposed to rejoice, count it all joy when you fall into divers temptations. You remember that? And then it offers this by way of explanation because we need an explanation for that, right? Count it joy when you suffer temptations and trials of life. How am I supposed to understand that, James? Knowing this, that the trying of your faith, notice, works patience. It works patience. But now over in James chapter 5, verse 8, well, we can actually go back up to verse 7. Here again, James, writing to the same group of people, he says, be patient, therefore. Again, verse 8, be ye also patient. But you know what? James, in the original language, is using two different words. He's not using the same word that he was back in chapter 1. When he says, the trial of your faith worketh patience. That's not what he's calling for here in chapter 5. Brother Woods, again, knowledgeable of the original languages, really helps us out here. He says it is noteworthy that the word translated patient here is not the same as then that thus rendered in first chapter of the epistle. There it is the word, and again, hupomone or something like that, it is to bear up under. But the first of these words, the ones that we find here in James chapter 5, which is the same word, that we find in 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 4. The first of these words, he says, is used to denote patience with people, with persons. The second, the one over in James chapter 1, is patience with things. In James 1, the writer there is bidding his readers to endure the trials of life, knowing that the exercise of patience produces strength of character. Friends, these things would fall into that realm. Because of the trials of life, when you are called upon to wait, when you are called upon to bear some difficulty just due to life, again, some health ailment, some injury, some loss, you are to bear up under that, find it even a reason for rejoicing. Why? Because it produces patience. It allows you to bear up under difficult circumstances, and that produces character. However, he says in James 5, the suffering saints here are to exhibit long suffering toward their tormentors, knowing that God will certainly avenge them and see to it that full justice is done. You see the difference? We don't have time to develop it, but if you read James chapter 5, in James chapter 5, the first verses, James, he no longer is addressing the brethren. He's addressing now rich people in the world. And you know what they've been doing to Christians? They've been taking advantage of them. They've been having them work for them and then withhold their wages. They've been having them work for them and then defraud them of their wages. They're the ones responsible for persecuting Christians. And James says, under those circumstances, you need to exercise this kind of patience, long temperance toward those people. He's not talking about the trials of life. They are trials, but now he's talking about how they are to react toward people who are responsible for, again, defrauding them of their money, of bringing hardships to their life, of persecuting those, opposing them. How are you to treat them? James, you're to be patient. The word he uses is 1 Corinthians 13:4, you need to be long-tempered. Long-suffering. Friends, this describes the person who has the opportunity to retaliate, to get back at, to return evil for evil. They have the ability, the opportunity to do it, but they don't. They suffer long. They're long-tempered. That's not an easy thing, is it? When we start talking about being patient, enduring, not only enduring, please remember, calm endurance, without complaint. When we start dealing with patience concerning other people who have damaged us, or whose, again, weaknesses, their defects, I don't know about you, but I find that very challenging. And then to think that's the first quality mentioned in the profile of agape love. Agape love is this. I have somebody very close to me in life speak to on a very regular basis. And this person, up in years, but it's very common in a conversation with them that they will say this to me: I'm so tired of people. I know what they're saying. I understand that. But this person is not a Christian, and for me to try to respond to that is very difficult. Sometimes what I'm left to do is just say, well, we're always going to have people that we got to deal with. And the reality is you can't control what other people do. We can only control with how we react to it. But can you appreciate in weariness somebody saying, I'm so tired of people? And doesn't it speak to the fact how that the patience of love, enduring long with people, and especially people who damage us, especially people who don't ever seem to be growing up and maturing, and their defects are constantly seeming to be obstacles for them and others. Can you appreciate the challenge when you ask yourself, how am I doing with true agape love? How am I doing just with the first one? The patience. How am I doing with that? And then can you appreciate why the Apostle Paul would be making a prayer like Ephesians 3? Father, I pray for these Christians that they can be rooted and grounded in love. That they somehow can know the length and the depth and the height and the breadth. That they can really know the love of Christ, which really cannot be fully comprehended, but if they could know it. We didn't look at the end of that verse of the petition, but he says, so that they can know the fullness of God. See, friends, God is love. And when you really get a handle on this, when you get your roots deep into this, when you get settled on agape love, you are going to have an experience of the fullness of God probably more than any other time. Because that's who God is. And that's who He wants us to be. And He wants us to exercise this. Agape love, which entails the patience of love. Again, how are we doing? I mean, that's the part I got to deal with personally. I got to learn it. I got to know it. So that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to get a little insight into it. But then ultimately, once I do understand what it is, then I've got to be practicing it. We'll take a look, Lord willing, a little further at this. We'll talk about some other things that Paul says right there in 1 Corinthians 13 that should help us, as we start talking about the patience of love. Remember, he says, love is not easily provoked. How often does our impatience come because of provocation? Or love bears all things? Wow. Love endures all things? Wow. But see, that should give us some insight into what this is all about. The patience of love. It's talking about enduring things. But more than enduring things, enduring people. Calm endurance. A reasoned response. Long-tempered. And friends, in the world and society that we live in, that can be so challenging. So challenging. And again, I'm not into politics, and this doesn't pertain just to politics, but say what you will about technology, it can be used for good or evil. But one thing I've noticed with regards to technology today, and especially this idea of tweeting, it appears some people will say the first thing that crosses their mind, without any kind of filter, without any kind of consideration of how it might impact somebody else, its ramifications, its consequences. Without any of that, it gives us an opportunity not just to think it in the privacy of our own home, but now we can right there type it in and let the world see it. And all of that, in my judgment, just makes this all the more challenging. The patience of love. So, it's not to put any of us on a guilt trip. Please understand. I'm just urging us, much like Paul did in his prayer, I'm just urging us to be honest with ourselves. You know, we'll sing songs about love one another. How are we doing with that? Because it's more than words. It's more than just a concept. It's how we behave. It's our actions. It's the only way you can really know this love is by our actions. And so just urging us all to be honest with it. And where we see improvement, a need for improvement, do that. And I excuse a lot of this because she's 9 years old. But don't say, I'm just not patient. Don't say that. I understand that from a 9-year-old. But just don't say that. Because if we're not patient, that's an admission of the fact, I got some work to do. I got to work on this. If I really want to be able to say, I'm practicing true agape love. And as we noticed last week, friends, I'm going to suggest you can't be pleasing to God and not practice true agape love. In those verses where it says God is love, it actually says, you know, if you claim to know God, if you claim to be born of God and you don't love, your claims are not true. They're not genuine. So that's how important these things are. And aren't you glad that God loves us? Our third and final point, when we get to it, Lord willing, but that's going to be the imitable example of love. The one that we're supposed to be imitating. And you know who that is, don't you? That's the one in whom we see the essence of love. He's the very one who defines love. And it is in His example that we see true agape love. And you know what His challenge is? I want you to imitate that. Isn't that what Jesus said? He said, love one another as I have loved you. As I've loved you. So we're thankful that God loved us and in that love sent His Son. And Jesus' love for us allowed Him to go to the cross, die there in our stead. And His love for us allows us to access that blood for the forgiveness of our sins, allows us to know about His resurrection, His glorification in heaven now. And God's love is so deep, it is so broad, it is so high, it is so wide that it encompasses every person and allows us one day to actually be with Him in heaven and share in Jesus' glory. You talk about love. There's a song I was introduced to. It says, if that's not love, then the ocean is dry, no stars in the sky, and the sparrow can't fly. That's true love. So if we can help you in the development of that, you're appropriating God's love through gospel obedience, please know we stand ready to help you in any way we can while we stand together and sing.